Alice Grant adjusted her scarf against the chilly evening breeze as she stood before the towering Carter mansion. The grand estate, framed by sprawling gardens and iron gates, loomed in front of her like a relic of forgotten glory. In her heart, uncertainty battled with determination. What if she wasn't enough? What if the man inside those walls was beyond saving? In her hands, she clutched a small suitcase containing her belongings and her unwavering determination. Alice had been hired to care for Lucas Carter, a once celebrated artist whose life had been shattered by a devastating accident. Now trapped in a vegetative state, Lucas was little more than a shadow of the vibrant man whose name once dominated art galleries around the world. For Alice, this wasn't just another job. It was a chance to make a difference, to apply the principles she had spent years studying as a psychologist. Yet, standing there, she couldn't ignore the growing weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. What if her methods failed? What if Lucas was beyond help? The gates opened silently, revealing a long driveway lined with ancient oak trees. As Alice approached the front door, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. But she quickly shook it off. This was why she became a psychologist, to find light in the darkest of places. What happens, Alice thought to herself, when a heart filled with empathy meets a mind lost in silence? As the heavy oak doors creaked open to reveal the somber interior of the mansion, Alice knew her journey with the Carter family was about to begin. Alice was greeted at the door by Nathan, the Carter family's loyal but reserved butler. His sharp eyes scanned her carefully, though his polite demeanor never faltered. "Miss Grant, welcome. Mrs. Carter is waiting for you in the study," he said with a slight bow, gesturing for her to follow. As they moved through the mansion's vast hallways, Alice couldn't help but take in her surroundings. The Carter mansion was breathtaking, but felt strangely lifeless. The walls were adorned with Lucas Carter's most iconic paintings, vivid landscapes, abstract portraits bursting with emotion, but a layer of dust coated everything, hinting at a home abandoned to grief. In the study, Sophia Carter was waiting. The wife of Lucas was everything Alice expected: elegant, poised, and distant. Her tailored suit and impeccable makeup radiated control, but her eyes betrayed a weariness. She rose from her chair as Alice entered, her movements as deliberate as her words. "Miss Grant," Sophia began, her tone cold and businesslike. "Thank you for coming. Let me make one thing clear. This will not be an easy task. Lucas's condition has been unchanged for months, and while I appreciate your qualifications, I'm skeptical about what you can accomplish." Alice swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the handle of her suitcase. "I understand, Mrs. Carter, but I believe there's always a way, if we're willing to try." Alice maintained her professionalism. "Mrs. Carter, I understand your concerns. My goal is to give Lucas the best care possible, and perhaps a chance at recovery." Sophia studied her for a long moment before nodding curtly. "Nathan will show you to your quarters in Lucas's room. I expect you to report any significant changes. And remember," she added, her voice dropping an octave, "this family does not tolerate failure." As Alice followed Nathan to the west wing of the house, her resolve only strengthened. She entered Lucas's room and was immediately struck by the sterile atmosphere. The bed was surrounded by state-of-the-art medical equipment, its steady beeps the only sign of life. Yet the room lacked warmth, no personal touches, no color, just a stark reminder of his current reality. Her gaze fell on Lucas. Even in his stillness, there was something striking about him. His features, though softened by months of inactivity, hinted at the man he once was: bold, creative, and full of life. Nearby, dusty paintbrushes and an unfinished canvas sat abandoned in a corner. Nathan spoke softly, breaking Alice's thoughts. "He was a remarkable artist, Miss Grant. Before the accident, his work inspired millions." Alice nodded, absorbing the weight of the challenge ahead. As she unpacked her belongings, one thought replayed in her mind. Lucas Carter was more than this silent figure in a bed. She just needed to find a way to reach him. Alice began her first day with Lucas early, entering his room as the morning sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains. She had moved quietly, careful not to disturb the silence that seemed to dominate the space. Standing by his bedside, she introduced herself softly. "Good morning, Lucas," she said, her voice calm and steady. "My name is Alice, and I'll be with you every step of the way. We'll take this one day at a time." The heart monitor's rhythmic beeping was her only response, but Alice wasn't discouraged. She knew this would be a long journey and that progress would be measured in the smallest of steps. Her first task was to make Lucas's environment less clinical. She repositioned his bed closer to the window, allowing more natural light to flood the room. She dusted off the neglected paintbrushes and arranged them on a small table next to an unfinished canvas. As she worked, Alice spoke to Lucas, filling the silence with stories from her own life. "You know," she said, carefully massaging his hand during physiotherapy, "I grew up in a small town. My mother always said that every problem had a solution, even if it wasn't obvious at first." Maybe she was right. By the end of her first week, Alice noticed something unusual. While reviewing Lucas's records with Nathan, she came across a mention of Shadow, Lucas's golden retriever. "What happened to Shadow?" she asked curiously. Nathan hesitated. "After the accident, Mrs. Carter sent him to the countryside. She believed it would be too painful to keep him here." Alice's mind raced. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was likely a key to unlocking Lucas's memories and emotions. "Nathan," she said with determination, "do you think we could bring Shadow back?" "It could make a difference." Nathan's expression softened, and after a pause, he nodded. "I'll see what I can do." A few days later, Shadow arrived. The moment Alice saw the dog bounding through the hallway, his tail wagging wildly, she knew she had made the right decision. She introduced Shadow to Lucas carefully, letting the dog sniff around the bed. Shadow's ears perked up as he seemed to recognize his owner, his tail wagging furiously. Without hesitation, the dog climbed onto the bed, nuzzling Lucas's hand as if urging him to wake up. Alice held her breath, leaning closer. For a moment, the room was still, and then it happened. A faint twitch of Lucas' fingers, like a whisper of life breaking through the silence. Her heart leapt. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you're still here." It was the smallest of movements, but it was undeniable. "Nathan," Alice called, her voice trembling with excitement. "Come quickly." When Nathan arrived, he stared in disbelief. "Miss Grant, is that?" "Yes," Alice confirmed, her eyes filling with tears. "It's a response. He's still in there." Encouraged by this breakthrough, Alice expanded her efforts. She played Lucas's favorite classical music, filling the room with the soothing sounds of piano and violin. She also began using aromatherapy, introducing scents like fresh paint and pine wood, fragrances connected to Lucas's work and past. But it wasn't just the therapeutic techniques that mattered. It was the presence of Shadow, who refused to leave Lucas's side. The dog would rest his head on Lucas's lap, his deep brown eyes filled with loyalty. One evening, as Alice prepared to leave the room, she paused to speak to Lucas once more. "You're doing great, Lucas," she said gently. "We'll keep going, step by step. You're not alone in this." In the dim light, Shadow let out a soft whine, as if echoing her sentiment. Alice smiled, feeling a growing sense of hope. For the first time since she had arrived, the Carter mansion didn't feel so lifeless. This was just the beginning, but Alice knew they were on the right path. One crisp morning, Alice decided it was time to take a bolder step. She entered Lucas's room with renewed energy and spoke as if they were longtime friends. "Lucas, I've been thinking," she began, pulling a chair closer to his bed. "This room is nice, but it doesn't feel like you. I read about your studio, where you created your masterpieces. How about we go there today? Maybe it'll help jog your memory." She turned to Nathan, who stood at the doorway. "Can you help me set things up in the studio? I want Lucas to be surrounded by his work again." Nathan hesitated, his brows furrowing in concern. "Ms. Grant, the studio hasn't been touched since the accident. Mrs. Carter might not approve. Alice gave him a determined look. If there's even a chance this could help him, it's worth the risk. By midday, Nathan had helped her prepare the studio. Dusty canvases were carefully arranged, easels stood upright, and the faint smell of turpentine lingered in the air. With the help of a portable medical chair, Alice and Nathan transferred Lucas into the room, positioning him near a large unfinished painting. Shadow followed, tail wagging, settling beside Lucas like a silent guardian. "This is where your magic happened, Lucas," Alice said, her voice soft but encouraging. She pointed to a canvas with bold strokes of color. "Do you remember this one? It's breathtaking." As Alice continued describing the paintings, Shadow jumped onto Lucas's lap, nudging his hand with his nose. For a moment, the room was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Then it happened. A faint, strained sound escaped Lucas's lips. "Shadow," he whispered. Nathan, standing nearby, clutched the back of a chair for support, his usually composed face slack with astonishment. "Miss Grant," he stammered, "did he just—" Alice nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He did. He's finding his way back," Alice confirmed, tears streaming down her face. "He said, Shadow." It was a breakthrough unlike any other. Lucas's first word in months signaled not just physical progress, but a spark of consciousness returning. Encouraged by this moment, Alice spent the rest of the day in the studio with Lucas. She played soft music and read aloud passages from art books, hoping to rekindle his passion. Shadow never left his side, his presence a constant source of comfort. That night, as Alice prepared to leave, she paused at the door. She glanced back at Lucas, who lay surrounded by his work, and smiled. "This is just the beginning, Lucas. We're getting closer." Lucas's recovery, though slow, was marked by profound and emotional progress. After his first word, Shadow, Alice committed to intensifying her therapeutic efforts, believing wholeheartedly that Lucas's mind was starting to reawaken. The first signs of improvement came during their morning sessions. Each day, Alice worked on Lucas's mobility, gently moving his arms and legs while speaking to him in an encouraging tone. "Good morning, Lucas," she would say softly. "Today we're going to stretch those fingers a little more." Slowly, his responses became more consistent. A faint twitch of a finger, or the slight movement of his foot during therapy. To reconnect Lucas with his past, Alice integrated familiar sensory experiences. She brought in Lucas's art supplies, brushes, canvas, and even his favorite turpentine scent, and used them during their sessions. One day, as she lightly brushed his palm with a paintbrush, Lucas's fingers curled slightly, as though grasping for something. The turning point came when Alice decided to take Lucas out of his room for the first time. With Nathan's help, they carefully transferred him to a wheelchair and brought him to the garden. The fresh air and sunlight seemed to invigorate him, and Shadow, ever the faithful companion, lay at his feet. Alice leaned close, speaking gently. "Lucas, this is the garden you used to sketch. Do you remember the roses? They're blooming beautifully now." As she described the surroundings, Lucas's lips moved. At first, it was a faint, unformed sound, but then he whispered, "Rose." Sophia, who had been watching from a distance, gasped. She rushed to his side, tears in her eyes. "Lucas, you can hear us?" she asked. Lucas blinked twice, a deliberate signal Alice had taught him for yes. From that moment, his progress accelerated. Alice introduced passive exercises to strengthen his muscles and incorporated music therapy with his favorite classical and jazz pieces. Each day, Lucas became more responsive, his voice growing stronger and his movements more deliberate. By the end of the season, Lucas could sit up on his own and form simple sentences. His recovery was a testament to resilience and the unyielding hope Alice brought to the Carter mansion, which was now filled with light, life, and the promise of new beginnings. A year had passed since Alice Grant first stepped through the gates of the Carter mansion. The once somber and lifeless home was now filled with laughter, light, and the vibrant hum of activity. Lucas Carter, who had been trapped in silence and stillness, was no longer a mere shadow of himself. His recovery, though hard-fought, had transformed not only his life but the lives of everyone around him. On a warm spring evening, the mansion's grand hall was abuzz with excitement. Family, friends, and art enthusiasts gathered to celebrate the debut of Lucas's new exhibition, his first since the accident. The gallery was filled with pieces that told the story of his journey, abstract strokes of darkness giving way to vivid bursts of color, a visual representation of despair conquered by hope. Alice stood near the entrance, watching the scene with quiet pride. Shadow, now a constant companion to Lucas, sat obediently by her side, his tail wagging at the joyful energy in the room. When Lucas appeared, walking steadily with the aid of a cane, the crowd erupted into applause. Sophia stood proudly by his side, her arm linked with his. As they reached the front of the room, Lucas turned to address the crowd. "Tonight isn't just about my art," he began, his voice strong and steady. "It's about the people who refuse to give up on me. My wife Sophia, whose strength carried us through the hardest days. My loyal friend Shadow, who reminded me what unconditional love looks like. And most of all, Alice Grant, who saw potential in me when I couldn't see it myself." Lucas turned to Alice, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Alice, you didn't just help me recover. You gave me my life back." The room was silent for a moment before erupting into cheers and applause. Tears streamed down Alice's face as she nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. As the night wound down, Lucas and Sophia approached Alice privately. "We've been discussing something important," Sophia said. "We'd like to fund a rehabilitation center for patients like me," Lucas added, his voice firm. "And we want you to lead it, Alice." Alice's breath caught in her throat, but as she looked at the faces of the people who had become like family to her, she smiled. "It would be my honor," she said. Under the warm glow of the chandeliers, the Carter family and Alice stood together, united by their shared journey. The mansion, once a place of sorrow, had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, miracles could happen when love, determination, and faith allied. And so, as the lights dimmed and the guests departed, the story of Lucas, Sophia, Shadow, and Alice didn't end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with infinite possibilities and a future shaped by the belief in second chances.